Peter, and thank you all colleagues for inviting me to share a few ideas with you today. We have in roughly around 15 minutes or so for me to introduce a few concepts, a few ideas, and then we have a bit of time after that to discuss, to address concerns, to tackle expressions of horror, and so on, in line with the content that I'm about to share with you. So to get us started, I'm going to share a screen, which hopefully you will be able to see in a moment. So there we go.
Thank you.
So let me just move this out of the way. That's it. Great. So that's the title, digital learning and teaching in higher education, the next chapter. There is a plan I've got for you today, which looks like that. I'll begin with some principles, and there is a health warning there that we could potentially debate those principles for the rest of the day. Some of them are debatable. Then I move on to a brief version of the active blended learning ABL story. That part of the presentation very much draws from my experience at the University of Northampton, where I was Dean of Learning and Teaching for from 2012 to 2020. So 8 years at Northampton. I moved to the University of Portsmouth 12 months ago. Then I'll move on to the pivot to emergency remote teaching, ERT. And then I'll introduce the notion of, in the context of ERT, emergency professional development, EPD. And I'll look at the next chapter, the post-COVID scenarios. And I would invite colleagues to reflect on what that might look like at your institution. So that's the plan for today. Let me begin with some principles. And I said I would, we could spend the rest of today looking at these. The first, I very much highlight the conjunction of good pedagogic design and teaching practice. Good pedagogic design that is student-centered, that is scalable, that is fun, and teaching practice that, in higher education, in my experience in the UK, this is my 5th UK institution, and globally, I've worked extensively in universities overseas, teaching practice continues to be highly problematic. Teacher education and staff development for teachers in higher education continue to pose a major barrier to successful learning experiences. The second bullet point is inspired in a book written by an American writer called Bill Sinzer. He wrote a book called On Writing Well. In chapter 1 of that book, Sinzer explains that the best way to write is to rewrite. Inspired by that, a good way to design is to redesign. And I'll try and delve into that a little more in the following slides. The third one focuses on the notion of engagement. And I have to say that engagement as a term, in my opinion, has been one of the most used, overused, and abused terms in the last 10 years in higher education. And yet, when you look at the literature on engagement, particularly learner engagement, authors struggle to define it without using engage in the definition. Clearly, when you define a term, you really need to avoid using the word you are defining in the definition itself. So we can talk about learning engagement and how to define it another day, perhaps. But for the purposes of today, the clear point is, if you want your learners to be with you, well, be with them. I really insist, this is very much linked to teaching practice, visible, active, and engaged tutors are required if we expect visible, active, and engaged students. The fourth bullet point revolves around a notion of content. As in higher education, over the decades, I've seen, and I continue to see, quite a lot of obsession with content. My students love my content, between brackets. In fact, that means I love my own content. My content is great. If you're nice to me, I can let you have a bit of my content. You talk about course design, and academics instantly think about creating content. And the point here is not that content is not important. Of course it is important, but it's not king. Context is. What matters is what our learners do with content, why they do it, how they do it, who they do it with. And that is again central to bullet point 1. Good pedagogic design that is not content centric, and good teaching practice that is not content centric. I am very, very careful about the use of the verb to deliver. I'll go into that in the last bullet point, but there are many, well, I'll do it now. There are many things we can do with, in, or about learning, but you cannot deliver learning. A lot of people deliver content. In other words, they deliver information. They don't deliver knowledge. They can't do that. They deliver information. And many of them dream, and in the fantasy world, they think they are teaching. They are actually delivering content. I would invite colleagues to challenge that and to think about teaching as an area of study rather than the stand up and spout approach that sadly continues to prevail across the sector, particularly involving people who never studied learning and teaching as a discipline. And that missing bullet point, second to last, is very much around the digital scene. If you want to encourage the use of wonderful things, wonderful toys that you think work, well, good teaching is a good starting point. It's a solid starting point for that. If there is a good pedagogic reason, maybe the purposeful technology adoption might follow. But the starting point, please, is good teaching practice. So this is a definition of active learning that I've used over the years, and I continue to find very powerful. Active learning is not just about doing, it's about thinking about the things we do. So ancient definition, but still very good, very powerful. I invite you to reflect on it, because it really informed my work on active blended learning, particularly at the University of Northampton. The university redesigned the entire portfolio of courses at course level and at module level for active blended learning. And it took me just over 5 years to do that, in collaboration with my team and with teams in the faculties to do this. And again, we can talk about the peculiarities of that process at some point. But so let me give you some headline statements for the purposes of the limited amount of time we've got today. If I show you that pre-session exposure, face-to-face session analysis, discussion and reflection, post-session consolidation, sounds okay. It might remind you of a number of phrases in learning and teaching in higher education. It might remind you indeed of the flipped classroom. Well, I've got 2 bits of bad news. One, if you look at this and you think it's great, think again. This doesn't work. It doesn't work very well. Please challenge this. Please be very critical of this. Second, those who use the flipped classroom as a nice, new, sexy terminology, the bad news is that the term might be new, but the concepts behind it are only about 2,000 years old. There's nothing really conceptually new here, other than the technologies that we might use to implement this. So I'm cutting a few corners here, but we had to transform this. We had to change this into something else. So let me show you two stages of the change. One is this. The key bit that is missing from the previous slide is the second block from left to right, the sense-making activities, linked to the obsession with content I mentioned before. The block in the red dotted line there is what we call the scaffold that extends into the classroom and beyond. What we need to think about when we design for effective student-centered learning is not just creating more and more content. It's not about bombarding people with content. It's about providing the right scaffold for people to take ownership of and to make sense of that content, to make it their own. And that is what I mean by spending time designing activities, designing appropriate scaffolds. You will notice that in this diagram, the word online doesn't feature. It's not about onlineness or face-to-faceness. Indeed, the definition of blended learning, looking at that old literature from the late 90s and early 2000s, which very much revolved around the combination, the meaningful combination of face-to-face and online. Again, think again. That is a rather simplistic, old hat type definition of blended learning. We have moved on. There are other dimensions of the blend that we have to consider, and we try to capture some of those here. But we as academics tend to dislike blocky, rigid diagrams like this. So there are other versions of this that people have come up with over the years. So this is one of them that we published in a recent book, and also in a couple of articles. The idea is exactly the same as the previous one. The word online is not there. There's a focus on synchronous and asynchronous rather than face-to-face and online. Sense-making activities continue to be center stage, right at the top. The scaffold continues to be there, and the narrative is the same, but it's probably more digestible than the blocky, rigid structure that we had in the previous slide. So what do we mean by active blended learning? This is the official, the published definition that we've used at Northampton for many years. So ABL is an approach to learning and teaching that combines sense-making with focused student interactions. If you're familiar with the community of inquiry framework, you will recognize learner, 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 tutor, learner content type interactions in a range of appropriate learning settings. It could be in the classroom, could be in the lab, could be in the field, could be at home. So that is what we mean, and we mean that and nothing else. And that was pretty much the mantra at Northampton for a number of years. At the University of Portsmouth, where I work now, we have something very similar to this. And again, I struggled to find a definition of what we call blended and connected learning. So I wrote one, and it soon after that it became policy, and that is what we actually mean by blended and connected at Portsmouth. Again, it's blended and connected means three things. The first one is the same as ABL, activity focused. Is what doing and thinking. That is what active learning should be about. The second, location, in and outside the classroom, in the lab, in the field, at work, synchronously and asynchronously, individually and in groups. And the third bullet point, it focuses on the application, development and application of subject knowledge, professional and digital skills. So I am conscious of time, so I need to move quick on this. I am leaving those references on ABL with Peter, but there are some interesting things to read about if you're interested. Think about your institution and think about change and think about COVID. Three types of change: Responsive reactive, something happens, we've got to respond. COVID is a typical example. Developmental incremental changes within the culture. Slow burn, if you like. So ABL is a good example. It took years to deploy and to scale it up. And radical innovative, it can be developmental incremental at the same time, hence why they overlap. But there are a few, if you like, left field ideas that might make a type of change unusual. So it is interesting to see how they interact, and they interact in different ways. But the main thing in the center is look at what our usually siloed institutions do sort of in the periphery, and look at what works and turn niche enhancement into the mainstream, move them across when we have evidence that they work. So this is pretty much innovation to mainstream, research to practice. And it is in that context that we need to situate what we mean by ABL. So ABL, active blended learning, at my previous university very much sits in that intersection of developmental incremental slow burn type thing with a few radical ideas which are reflected in the principles that I shared right at the start. When we move into COVID environments and the like, emergency remote teaching and emergency professional development very much sit there. They have the typical features of responsive reactive, but the way that we implemented them and the way in many cases were implemented across institutions globally do have elements of radical or of very innovative key elements to that. So the pivot to emergency remote teaching and beyond, the first thing to say here is that active blended learning was unexpected preparation for emergency remote teaching. So our work since 2014 at Northampton, course redesign at scale for active blended learning gave us fantastic preparation for emergency remote teaching. We were nearly there when lockdown hit us in March 2020. It did require on-the-fly emergency professional development. So things that we were doing before had to change quite quickly overnight to meet the needs of colleagues who were in teaching at the time and had to change suddenly from ABL to full online practices. We think, as we have noticed in other institutions, including my own now at Portsmouth, that other places where such redesign had not happened, they found that pivot to be a lot more painful than we did. So we researched, and there's a book chapter coming out of this. We researched how prepared people were to emergency remote teach. And this slide contains a number of features of the research, some of the demographics. Now, some of these things need to be taken with a pinch of salt. So, for example, the second bullet point there says that 50% of the staff that we spoke to or that completed the online questionnaire claimed that they conducted pedagogical redesign. When you delve deeper into that, I would question what that pedagogical redesign was. They changed a few practices. They didn't necessarily change their approach to learning and teaching or the concepts that provide a rationale for the things that they do. Similarly, we could question the other findings from there. So what does that mean? It means that staff in emergency remote teaching faced a number of needs and challenges. There was limited direction from the institutions. People realized that emergency remote teaching was not proper online learning. The fourth bullet point, as I said before, the absence of teacher training in higher education generated a huge problem. Just to illustrate that point, colleagues, teachers were unaware, my colleagues were unaware of what a lesson plan looks like. This is page 1 first book in teacher education at PGCE level, primary, secondary. However, in higher education, people didn't know what a lesson plan was. Crazy, but true. So that was how to plan a lesson in an online environment was the most popular, by far, the most popular workshop that we ran in April and May 2020. Emergency professional development took multiple forms. So this is a slide that captures some of those key things. Many higher education teachers learn about teaching as they teach. No surprise. Sad, but no surprise. They learned about online practices as they were teaching online. No surprise. Apologies for the cartoon on the right. It is in Spanish, but I think you can guess what it is. In 1970, I will dictate my notes. In 1990, I will give you photocopies of my notes. In 2010, I will give you a PowerPoint of my notes. In 2019, I'll put my notes on a Google Drive. Technology changes, the teaching approach doesn't. Let's not bombard people with notes and content. Let's do something better than that. Pre-COVID, my institution, that before and now, are traditional campus-based institutions. The bread and butter, the income, depends on traditional campus-based provision, typically run in face-to-face mode. We did, and we do, bits of the other quadrants. So we did bits of low proximity, low synchronicity, so typical distance learning, and the other two. But the key area of work was the campus-based. Now, we need to think again here. If we take the two axes again, synchronicity, high-low, proximity, high-low, the top left, for example, is the situation in which most of our campus-based students found themselves in when lockdown hit. So they are based in the halls of residence, but they were unable to attend face-to-face seminars on campus. So what about them? What about those who had to return home to the top right, low proximity as well as low synchronicity? So the next chapter for me is very much one where higher education will revolve around the notion of lower synchronicity and lower proximity than what we were used to prior to COVID. I think we need to factor that in a very serious way as we plan our courses from now on. Lower proximity, lower synchronicity. What that means is that we will continue to do the bottom left, our traditional campus-based, but we will need to do the other quadrants better than what we were doing pre-COVID. So if we assume that we are we are fine, we're comfortable with the high, the traditional campus-based environment, we need to really focus on the bits that, in my opinion, we were less good at. And certainly my institution was less good at, sort of the top right and certainly the other two. That's how pretty much we're planning our courses and our redesigns, and we are doing redesign again here at Portsmouth, going forward in a post-COVID environment. So colleagues, the plan was that we have more or less gone slightly over, but we covered a few principles, some of them debatable. We went to the ABL story, looked at emergency remote teaching and professional development, and we briefly considered post-COVID scenarios. With that, I'll pause and I'll hand back to Peter to moderate conversation in the time that we've got left. So back to you. And I think you're muted.
Thank you very much, Ali. I'm just going to stop your share there as well, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Just want to say thank you so much. Very enlightening and insightful. It's interesting to see, first of all, that the overlap between active blended learning and Garrison's work on communities of inquiry interesting as well to look at that move away from quantifying the blended learn over 20% face-to-face, 80% online, or whatever that blend might be, that it's more about why we're blending and the objectives we're trying to reach by blending, and to make that more of an active learning experience. Interesting to see that so many people were unaware of what a lesson plan looks like. I would wonder what kind of result we get if we'd run a similar survey here in Waterford Institute of Technology. It's made me reflect as well on our own pivot, that there was maybe a focus on upskilling people on tech because that's where the deficits or the immediate deficits were. People couldn't use the technologies used for distance learning. They couldn't use, I suppose, some of the other tools that we needed to, I suppose, get to the end of the semester. We had 3 or 4 weeks of teaching left, so we had to focus on the technologies. And what became more and more apparent over time, and it was great to see some of the communities of practice we had on it last year from colleagues in humanities, was the focus on redesigning their teaching and learning. And perhaps as well, when we talk about the low synchronicity and proximity, and I suppose we liken that maybe to some of the work that we've done on our own higher diploma in computer science, and what we think is an engaging learner experience, which has me questioning, is it truly engaging now? And I must look up those definitions. You know, we're creating a rich peer supportive environment for students, and where lectures are present, using Slack and other tools like Teams to create this always on community for students. So it made me kind of re-examine a lot of the things we're already doing in our practice, and potentially some things that we can do in the future. And one of those is maybe to focus more on digital teaching and learning, and not just on being a center for technology enhanced learning, where maybe the focus is, you know, in the name, it's a center for technology enhanced learning. We're putting technology before the learning, and we might need to revisit that. So I just wanted to say thank you very much again, and if everyone would like to give a physical or a virtual round of applause, that would be great. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And I invite anyone, if you have any questions, you might put up your hand, or if you want to, again, physical or virtual hands, we can go to those questions. Joanne, I don't know if you're giving a round of applause or have a question. Just a round of applause then. Laura McGibney, you're first up with the hand, if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Hi, Elaine. Thanks for that. That was very interesting. I'm not in the academic side of things, but I do support online learners. And I was interested at your scaffold and putting in the sense-making activities. All that makes sense. But I suppose if that's done in isolation, like if it's taken a lecturer by lecturer approach, then it could end up being overload on the learners. So I would think it needs to be a program-wide approach or a course-wide approach. And I suppose what I'm wondering to ask you is, did you have any resistance from staff to going down this route? And if you did, how did you manage that?
All right. The scalable approach to what we call learning design works at module level and at program level, and you've got to do both. When you're you grab a BA in whatever discipline, you look at the BA as a program, and then you look at its components, and you run what we call a team-based approach to course design that operates at both levels. Again, success comes not just from designing or redesigning, it also comes from implementing that through excellence in teaching practices. A poor teacher, there's no good design that will help, but a brilliant teacher can recover even very poor design. Did we have resistance? Of course we did. Of course, it wouldn't be a massive institution-wide change management program if we didn't expect resistance. We had resistance from a number of fronts and for a number of reasons. A typical one was well, the assumption that all of this was going to be done on the basis of or for very mysterious reasons, like saving money, or sort of the agenda was being questioned. Another one was, well, I've been doing what I'm doing for the last 20 years. Why are you challenging me to do it differently? Another one was, oh, you're doing this because the university is building a new campus, which opened in 2018, and the new campus has no lecture theatres and it has no staff offices. Actually, the new campus was designed without lecture theatres because of this approach, rather than the other way around. How did we manage that? That is a very long story, but I would summarize it with 3 pillars. The 3 pillars are evidence, support, and agency. Evidence for why we're doing what we're doing, evidence from the sector, as well as homegrown evidence that it works in our context. Context is king, not content. Support in order for people to move ahead in the teaching careers, in how they operate as higher education practitioners. We had to put in the support. The lesson planning workshop is just a tiny example of that, but we had to support them in as they changed from what they were or where they were into ABL practices, as we call them. An agency, equally important. Agency means power, and we had to, and we were very happy to leave those final decisions, the power to decide what is appropriate, in the hands of those who were doing the teaching. So we were not prepared to police this. We were not prepared to invigilate. We were not prepared to do observation for performance management. That agency remained with colleagues. What we did do as part of the evidence and the support was a lot of work, a lot of staff development work around the area of micro teaching, around the area of safe, peer-based, peer observation of practices. So those were the other key workshops that we ran, where I don't know if any of you in the room have done teacher training for primary or secondary schools, but a usual practice in that is to get your hands dirty with teaching, to be observed, and then to be ripped apart in the safe environment of a handful of colleagues who look at your recordings, who looked at your practices, and can give you detailed feedback on what worked and what didn't. Evidence, support, and agency were the 3 key things that we used to manage that.
That's a great takeaway, Ali. Thank you very much. Laura, that answer, are you happy with that?
Yeah, I suppose I was more looking at it from the learner. Did any of the learners end up feeling overloaded from, like, if each individual lecturer decides, okay, I'm going to do this pre-session exposure, and they have a full timetable, but all lecturers, or it's not coordinated approach, do the learners end up ultimately overloaded? But yeah, my second part of the question was about staff buying into it. Yeah. Okay,
so just briefly on the learner side, we didn't have much pushback at all from learners. We ran a lot of engagement sessions prior to the move to the new campus, and as we were rolling out the redesign for ABL, to summarize the view of learners, it wasn't one of resistance. Actually, the resistance came from staff rather than learners. The learners said something like, I'm paraphrasing here, we chose this university, we trust that you will do a good teaching job with us. We don't really want to get ourselves sort of involved in the nitty-gritty of deciding what teaching approaches work or don't work. It is true that my parents expected lectures and the new campus will have no lecture theatres. That's true, but we trust you to do a good job when it comes to teaching. I mean, I'm characterizing this a bit, but that's largely what the sentiment was.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ali. That's a great answer for that. Claire, I think you had a question as well. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Laura, it actually kind of builds on what you were asking there about the scaffolding and that. So thanks a million, Ali, for the presentation. It was really interesting. An awful lot of food for thought in that. But what I wondered was, you spoke about the activities to scaffold the content and put that into context. Would you have any advice about the optimum type of activities to use within an online environment for students?
Yes, yes, and I did mention that the approach, actually more than the method that we use to scale up course design is well researched and well established, and there's a lot of material published on this. But going specifically to the part of that workshop that focuses on activity design, there is the short answer is, do not just focus on knowledge testing or knowledge checking activities. Do not focus on deliver, quiz, deliver, quiz. That's not good enough. And I know many of you will be doing this already, so I might be stating the obvious, but a lot of my colleagues, or for a lot of my colleagues, this was not obvious. The difficult activities to design are the knowledge generating activities. The difficult activities to design are the forward-looking ones. Writing a quiz, using your VLE or some other tool to generate a knowledge checking thing is very, very easy. Generating activities or creating activities that look forward is not that easy if the activity is supposed to be good. So my brief advice on that, Claire, would be look at activity types. Go beyond the obvious questions. Many colleagues say to me, my lectures and my seminars are interactive. I ask a lot of questions. Well, we need to do more than ask questions. An activity is not just a question. An activity is much more complicated than that. We need to design them well. And that would be the topic of a longer conversation. But another typical one. I'm already doing this because, you know, I do this. I ask them to read this, read the other, watch this, watch the other, and come back with 3 key points. No, that is not good enough. We need to do better. An activity is not just sending people away to read that, watch the other, and come back with 3 points. We've got to design for learning in a much more sophisticated way than that. So that's the kind of advice I would begin with when we go down the route of student-centeredness, of ABL type approaches, and that's the sort of practices that we most struggled to change.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ali. And in terms of that design for learning, would you look at maybe like Gilly Salmon's Carpe Diem learning design model, or the Cairo model for, I suppose, structuring that change in the learning design?
Yes, those are 2. Well, Cairo is indeed an adaptation of Carpe Diem. So we started with that and we ran round about 500 Carpe Diem or Cairo workshops in a period of about 5.5, 6 years at Northampton. So we had to also scale up the facilitators, the skill set of the facilitators that would be able to run a successful workshop like that. We also experimented with, and here at Portsmouth, we're having an experimentation process with a blend of Cairo Carpe Diem with another approach, which is the ABC that comes out of London, the ABC Learning Design process. By the way, all the resources used for all of those workshops are actually open educational resources. You can download those and use them and try them and experiment with them. But what I would say is that the downloading the packages alone will not give you the full picture. You've got to really take part in those types of workshops yourselves in the flesh. And then it's only after that you realize how powerful they can be. In the words of participants, having done these workshops, many of them come back for many iterations of these workshops because they use the workshop to redesign different modules. And they say, well, we've been messing around with this module or this course for 3 years. We did a one-day workshop and we sorted it. Yeah, that's the kind of power. That's why it's relatively low cost, high impact. And that's why we use those to redesign the entire portfolio.
Brilliant. Before I bring Neil in, the project in Northampton sounds incredibly large. So I just wondered, I mean, you talk a lot about the change management, facilitating so many workshops, the time frame involved in planning and executing such a large and wide-ranging project in tandem with building a 400 million euro new campus without any lecture rooms or any staff offices. It must be incredible. So would you mind talking just a bit about the timescale involved and the size of the team involved in the transformation process in Northampton University?
It depends on how you measure it. My responsibility was not estates, clearly. My responsibility was not, I had to inform the work of the architects and the interior designers and all that, but that was secondary. My main job was deploying the model and making sure that what we subsequently called our signature pedagogy for Northampton, ABL, was robust in terms of pedagogic evidence, that it was scalable, that it was something that tutors were prepared to use, adapt, and have their own versions of it, multiple versions of it, that are appropriate to discipline, to context, to type of learners, and so forth. That was very much my responsibility. For that, in a small institution, bearing in mind Northampton is quite small, 10,000 students, and a campus that, as you know, changed in 2018 from something like 36 small buildings to three buildings altogether. My job revolved or used the expertise of a central team of learning designers, and these are academics at the same grade as a lecturer. They are not support people, they are not professional services, they are academics with the same grade as a lecturer, in collaboration with learning technologists, one grade below. Those were the key personnel, and in terms of team size for that central element, sort of the hub, if you like, that was, let me just think, 12, 13 people. And then we have the spokes into the faculties with trained facilitators there as well. So we had, at that time, we had 4 faculties. Now they have 3. But at that time, the 4 faculties, each faculty had another 3 or 4 facilitators, of course, working only part-time for us. But that was the engine behind the transformation on the ground. Those were the people who interacted with colleagues. Those were the people who ran workshops. Those were the people who reported the results. Those were the people who fed results into dashboards and enabled us to monitor the change process and enhancement process. So it wasn't a particularly large team. It might be in terms of headcount, but in terms of full-time equivalent, they were not very. We didn't have a lot of people available, which speaks volumes about the scalability of the model itself.
Fantastic, and I suppose it speaks as well to the buy-in from management and the confidence in that vision.
Yes, and this is a usual question I get, Peter. I hear over and over again, senior management buy-in. Well, I tell you one thing. The Vice Chancellor and I had several conversations, and Northampton had has no pro-vice chancellors, had no layers in between. It's very flat. Our deputy vice chancellor was only recently appointed, but there's nothing else. The money was there, the effort was there, the enthusiasm was there, the support was there explicitly. The barriers came from other parts of the institution. People, I can identify those. For example, the quality unit. Oh, can you really do that? Will the regulations allow you to do? Well, if they don't, then change the regulations. And we did. We changed the regulations. But what about this? Well, I tell you, senior management buy-in was a breeze. It was beautiful. Now, engagement, going back to that term, from lower down the food chain was harder, much harder, including the professional services side of the house.
Very interesting. Neil, I leave you in here for your question.
Oh, thanks, Pete, and thanks, Ali, for your time today. It's fascinating. I'm just wondering about the campus without the lecture theatres, and for students who, your typical undergraduate students who do want to be in a university environment and on site and whatever, what mix of kind of teaching and learning spaces did you employ to roll out your model?
The typical size is 30. Flat rooms 30, a handful of about, I think, let me just think from memory, 12 rooms on the campus had, flat rooms had extended capacity of 60. We had smaller rooms as well of 20. And we had one Harvard-style circular room that was quite small. We had one of such room. From memory, it's about 70-seater capacity. Very posh, very digitally rich, and that was it. So the model was not predicated, absolutely not predicated on saving money. Indeed, it can be an expensive way of doing things if you factor in multiple teaching, if you factor in the need to repeat sessions in small groups. And that was a key consideration right at the start. We knew that the teaching hours would increase. We knew that people in big courses, the psychologies of this world, the computer science of this world, the sort of the nursing with cohorts in year one of 300 or 400, for a small institution like Northampton, that's large. It's not large in other contexts, but in the past, those used to be split into 2 or 3 groups of 100, 150 each. Now we had to split them up in much smaller groups, typically of using the flat spaces of 60 and 70. Yeah, we had to multiple teach, and that meant workload allocations that differed from the old campus. The model was predicated on small group teaching. The model was predicated on quality contact time. The model was predicated on contact time that happened in and outside the classroom, physically and online. And we knew it wasn't cheap, but we also knew that given the profile of students that Northampton attracts, low income, lower grades than the average, that level of personalization was essential to, particularly in year one, to get them through and to move them through the years and onto graduation and employment. It was a deliberate move to do that, and away from the massification of large lecture theatres.
And is there a special type of self-directed learning spaces that are required for success of the model, do you think? Special, different types of areas in libraries and whatever, noisy areas, quiet areas.
Oh, right. Yes, and the best way to show you that would be to invite you to visit it. And sadly, I'm no longer an employee there, but I have many good friends who would give you a good guided tour of those. If you like, the best example of this is the Learning Hub. It is a building the largest of the three, that that combines the library with learning spaces, with cafes, with quiet study spaces, with academic space for colleagues, quiet zones, noisy zones, ample room for private confidential conversations, tiny rooms, capacity 3 or 4 people to do that, either through booking or rock up and use. The integration of those spaces was absolutely central to the design. The mastermind of the learning hub of that building is the director of Library and Learning Services, Chris Powers. And I do, if you're particularly interested in those things, in building design and integrating spaces like what I described, I think you do very well to speak to Chris. Just to be clear, the open plan areas are not call centers. They do not appear like hot desking. Absolutely not. Because of the integration of space with kitchens, with sofas, it looks very, very different from what you might associate with a call center. So you need to go in and have a look. You can make those spaces look comfy, inviting, conducive to thinking. Yes, you might argue, but I will still get distracted. And I do have presentations around what's called activity-based working, which is in the literature what this is called. And there are disadvantages, clearly there are. But the building also has quiet zones for when you want to either do your own research, your own thinking, your own contemplation, or indeed when you want to work on screens that you don't want other people to look at. And the building has all of those. Best way to appreciate this is a visit. I should also say, Neil, if I may, that a typical follow-up question I get at this point is, I can bet you the Vice Chancellor kept his office. The answer is no. No, he didn't. He relinquished his office 5 years before the move and started working pretty much hot desking himself with a backpack and working anywhere he could. His office, or the office of the Vice Chancellor, is actually an open plan space with a lot of people working in it, and it's very noisy and it's very messy as well. So no, he doesn't have an office either.
Thanks, Ali. And just to touch on something you mentioned there about the technology or the rooms and the way that they're situated. Technology is important, but it's what we do with it and what staff and students do with it that's important. And that's not putting words in your mouth. You've said it before. So how we use technology to enable students to benefit from outstanding learning experiences is what we should be trying to do. And I think it's important as well to say that with the rooms that you've taken out the computers out of those rooms. You've taken out the keyboards, all the devices. You've gone with Barco WeConnect, which we investigated for another purpose here in WIT, to enable active learning spaces. We've seen applications in Bolton University with the Sony Vision Exchange system that they had to achieve something like that as well, where it creates a very rich experience of students grouped together in pods working on a common task on a single shared screen, and there's multiple shared screen spaces and pods in a classroom, and the lecturer is able to present those shared screens to the rest of the group. The technology, while it's important to have in place, it's not the technology that's important. It's what you do with that technology that's incredibly important.
I would much rather have a very good teacher than very good technology. Let's put it that way. And to reverse the argument, if a teacher is very, very worried that they might be replaced by technology, then they should.
Controversial, but true. True, I'd 100% agree. Would anyone else like to ask a question? I'm conscious of time, both Ali's and your own. Would anyone else like to ask a question either in the chat function or to put up their hands or open their mics and ask a question? No.
I would just say, Pete, that there are many things we didn't talk about today, and many things that might be relevant to your institution, not least in what we call the technology or the digitally rich environment of that new campus, and pretty much what we're doing here at Portsmouth with the new Victoria Park building, which is something similar. We took a few risks, sometimes expensive risks, with some of this technology. As you said, we removed the vast majority of computers from common areas. We give first-year students a laptop. There are no computers in teaching rooms at all. There are flat screens in most rooms, more than one flat screen, massive in size, and you connect wirelessly to those through the barcode system. And that was a risk. It didn't work very well at the start. People had lots of problems with it. And the main problem was that they were a bit, sometimes things got a little bit complicated with the use of that. It was not seamless. As things progressed since 2018, that technology became a little bit easier to use, and things improved. But initially we had a huge amount of pushback, because actually it was a lot easier to grab an HDMI cable and plug it in, rather than faff around with barcode to get it to work. So we did take risks, and a risk-friendly attitude is essential. If you're not prepared to do that, you might as well abandon any digital innovation project. But things in the end, things did work out, and we are taking similar risks here at Portsmouth as we build a massive new building called the Victoria Park building. We are facing similar challenges, and we are going to experiment with newer versions of similar technologies that enable student-centeredness in the classroom, content sharing, task sharing, and co-creation, particularly co-creation.
Fantastic. All that remains for me then is to thank you again for your time, Ali. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to having you back at some point in the future for hopefully a seminar series next year. I think the parallels between Northampton and ourselves extend to just the numbers of students. We're somewhat similar in terms of size and scale, and hopefully our ambitions will be somewhat the same as Northampton's as well. It's fantastic to see the work that you've done in Northampton, and I look forward to seeing the work that you're doing in University of Portsmouth as well, in the building, and not just the building, but also the pedagogy that building enables. I really appreciate your time and the time of everyone here on the session. Thank you for taking the time out of your day, your lunchtime, to hear Ali talk. And it's great to, I suppose, take a step back from the practice and method of teaching and have a look at the overall importance of it in teaching and learning in the third level and higher level context. So thank you very much, Ali. Thanks to everyone. Round of applause once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all, and see you all very soon, hopefully in situ this time.
Yes, it'd be nice to have you over, Ali. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you all again soon. Take care.